Now just a quick reminder that these are true stories and not for the faint of heart. So, if you get scared easily, then do not watch past the timestamps that will be put up top right. Also, I'd like to say I don't condone the actions taken by the original posters, but I do believe in standing up for yourself. So, let's jump into the stories. Starting us off today, we have the host that watched from the walls. I booked a cabin in the middle of nowhere in rural Montana. My friend and I were excited for a getaway from the city and the sounds of civilization. We got to the house and it was nice. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, well-equipped kitchen, nice little porch overlooking a field. The listing said the hosts would greet us upon arrival, but when we got there, no one was around. There was a key hidden under a rock like was instructed. As we started to unpack, I noticed that almost every picture frame had a hole behind it. At first I assumed the hosts had hung pictures crooked. It didn't make sense that they'd go to the trouble of putting up a picture only to have it crooked. Some of the holes looked old, some looked fresh. Then I heard the sound of fingernails scratching on wood, like someone was trying to slowly scratch their way through a wooden surface. My friend and I looked at each other, unsure if we should stick around. We decided to stay because 1, we paid for the place, and 2, it was probably just mice. Later that night, I woke up and heard the noise again. This time it sounded like it was coming from just outside our bedroom wall. My friend and I got up and went out to the porch to see if we could find an animal. There was nothing out there but a deer in the field. When we came back in, we found a set of small footprints stamped into the soft mud at the edge of the porch. It was definitely a human footprint, possibly a child's, and we knew whoever it was had come from the field because there was no other way to get to the porch. We locked the doors, turned off all the lights and went to bed. Around 4 a.m., I woke up again. The scratching noise was now coming from inside the house and it was getting louder. Whatever was making the noise seemed to be moving around the house, occasionally scratching loudly before going silent again. When the sun came up, we got out of bed and started looking around. That's when we saw it. Every single room in the house had a false wall. You could tell they were false because the paint stopped abruptly at the seam with the real wall, leaving about a foot-wide gap between the fake wall and the real one. And many of the seams were covered with baseboard. But there was no baseboard in the kitchen. And when we pulled aside the curtains there, we saw that there was a gap there too. And that's when my friend and I discovered the crawl space. Whoever built the house had installed these false walls to create a crawl space that ran through the entire house. It was about 1.5 feet tall and just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Someone had crawled through the space earlier that night because the footprints in the mud matched the size of the crawl space perfectly. There was also a place in the bathroom where the wallpaper had been ripped off the wall and there was a hole in the dry wall behind it, big enough for a person to squeeze through. I texted the host, "I found a crawl space that goes through your house." He replied, "Thanks for letting me know," which seemed kind of weird. And then he sent, "Enjoy the rest of your day." No mention of him coming to fix it or anything. My friend and I peed out of there. I messaged the host again saying, I'm pretty sure it's pretty dangerous and illegal to have a crawl space like that without the proper ventilation and exits. I never got a reply. He did eventually respond to my second message and said he was sorry I had a bad experience. He offered me a partial refund and I accepted. The entire time I was watching my phone waiting for him to say something. Anything about how he was gonna get that fixed. You know, make sure the next guest doesn't fall victim to whatever was crawling around the house. Nothing. As soon as I messaged him about the crawl space, he became ghosting me. And even after I mentioned the safety concerns, all I got was a "sorry, you had a bad experience" message. I was expecting more, I guess. I mean, obviously it wasn't safe to stay there. What if someone got stuck in there? What if someone panicked and couldn't find the hole to get out? It felt like he was doing it on purpose. I'm glad I left when I did, because who knows what else he has planned. That was the host that watched from the walls. And next we have the evil landlord that showed up unannounced. If you're watching this, please contact me. I have several questions for you. But anyway, moving on to the next story. We all love a good scare every once in a while, don't we? And what better way to get one than from a stranger's home? However, sometimes the scariest part of these stories isn't what happens in the house, but rather the aftermath, just like in our next story. So, if you're watching this, please contact me. I have several questions for you. Who was crawling around in the walls? Do you think it was the host? Why else would he offer you a refund? Do you think it was malicious compliance? Or was he just trying to hide his mistake? Let me know in the comments down below. This is the sound of my voice. You're watching this right now because you found this video. I was asked to help out a friend. My friend had a little bit of an unusual story about some guests she had. Let me tell you about it. She's one of those people who likes to do Airbnb and stuff like that. She rents out her place when she's not using it, and she had some guests come up. These are the messages that she got from the guests. They were a young couple. So she arranged for them to check in, gave them the code, all that sort of thing. While they were staying there, the girl who owns the house noticed something odd. She saw what looked like a blinking red light coming from inside the smoke alarm on the ceiling. She couldn't quite make out what it was at the time, so she just assumed it was just a faulty wire or something. When the guests left, though, they left behind a phone. It didn't have any SIM card in it, but it did have Wi-Fi access. As a curious person, the owner of the house decided to scan it with a Wi-Fi scanner to see if she could figure out what model of phone it was. What she found instead was that the phone was connected to multiple other devices on the Wi-Fi network. Devices like webcams, a smart plug, a smart light bulb, and a Nest thermostat. Now that's pretty weird. I mean, when you rent out your house, you take most of your stuff with you. But a thermostat and a smart bulb? Yeah, I guess that's reasonable to leave behind. But why would you leave a camera and a plug socket thing? Well, she decided to get a little more information. The app told her that it was an Android phone, but it didn't have any way to identify the model number. So she took it into the bedroom where the smoke detector was to try to get a better signal. As soon as she walked into the bedroom, the device suddenly disconnected from the Wi-Fi and stopped responding. Now it wasn't until later that she discovered that one of the lights was also a camera, which I will admit is kind of obvious in hindsight. But here's the really bizarre part. When she scanned the Wi-Fi again, she found another wireless access point. This was a Wi-Fi hotspot that wasn't broadcasting its name. That's what's known as a rogue access point. Now she did know that her guests had been filming themselves while they were there because they posted clips to TikTok and things like that. But this was before the days of TikTok being able to geotag locations. So she had no idea where the videos were from. She knew, however, that the video was recorded in her house. The paintings on the walls, the layout, all that sort of thing. But how could she be sure? I mean, you can't prove a negative, right? Well, she had one trick up her sleeve. She went into her garage and grabbed an old GoPro that she used to use when she filmed her cooking videos. She wanted to see if maybe the camera was a GoPro because hers was an older model that didn't have Wi-Fi. She loaded up the GoPro app on her phone and sure enough, it detected the camera in the room. Now she was able to view the camera live and there was even audio. She listened in for a moment and heard nothing. Then the front door opened and she heard the voices of her two guests. The man was talking about how he was getting food from the local convenience store. The woman was asking him to hurry up because she wanted to watch the sunset. So they were still in the house, but where were they? She tried to move the camera to face down the hallway, but the only thing that she could see was the back of the couch. It wasn't until she realized that there was a second camera in the living room that she was finally able to see them. They were sitting on the floor, facing away from the cameras. It was then that she noticed that the camera was plugged into a smart plug. It made sense that this would have been set up by the owners of the house, but it was set to automatically turn off at 10 p.m. That meant that the camera hadn't been recording since 10 o'clock that night. That raised another question. Why were they filming? What were they doing? There was a whole bunch of electronics equipment around them, including what appeared to be a laptop. There was a tripod beside the couch, which suggested that they were trying to build some sort of a studio in her house. Then she noticed that one of the lights on the Christmas tree was blinking. It was then that she remembered that she had another camera up in the attic, one that she never used because it couldn't see anything. She pointed her phone up at the camera and sure enough, it showed a live view of the attic. It was too dark to make out details, but she could hear what was going on. Her guests were running around the attic like animals, scampering over the insulation and moving objects around. She could hear them talking, laughing. It was clear that they weren't trying to be quiet. But why were they up there? What were they doing? Just as she began to wonder whether she should call the cops, the feed cut out. The phone lost connection to the cameras. The last thing that she saw was the silhouette of the couple against the wall. They seemed to be making a final adjustment to something. Maybe they were hiding something. It was only then that she noticed that the phone was missing. It was no longer on the table where she had left it, and she had a strong suspicion that her guests had taken it with them. That meant that she didn't have any way to watch the cameras anymore. There was no way to log in remotely. She had no idea what they were doing in her house. I don't know about you, but I would have called the cops at this point, but she didn't. Instead, she went to the police station and asked them if they could trace the Wi-Fi signal. That would lead them straight to the feed. Now the cops said that they would look into it, but this was several years ago. Technology changes fast. Back then, the average cop didn't know anything about Wi-Fi or computer stuff. It was a totally different world. Smartphones were just starting to catch on and nobody was really using wireless cameras. The police looked into it, but they didn't have any luck. Then she decided to take matters into her own hands. She bought an $8 USB Wi-Fi adapter to convert the laptop into a wireless device. With that, she was able to connect to the Wi-Fi network and view the cameras once again. This time, however, she was prepared. She turned off all of the lights and watched as her guests slowly came back into the house. At first, they didn't notice the cameras. They were talking in hushed tones about their evening plans. They had a backpack with them, the same one that was in the picture. They began to unpack a bunch of equipment, the same equipment that was in the video from the day before. She watched as they set up a tripod and positioned the camera. But this time, they weren't filming the Christmas tree, they were filming each other. They were sitting on the couch and making silly faces, pretending that the camera wasn't there. They must have realized that the power was off because they started to laugh and talk normally. They began talking about their trip. They talked about how much they liked the house and how nice it was. But she didn't care about that. She pressed record and waited patiently. After a while, they started to notice the camera. They tried to hide, but she kept track of them. They moved to the bedroom, then they moved to the kitchen. They played games. They cooked chicken, but all the while, she was watching. At one point, the woman changed into a nightgown and got under the covers. The man brought her a glass of water. He leaned over and kissed her goodnight. He got up to go to the bathroom. That's when she noticed something strange. He had a tattoo on his arm, a weird spiderweb type tattoo. She recognized it from one of the pictures that they had posted online. The fact that she knew that meant that she had been watching them for a lot longer than she thought. How long? I don't know. How long do you want to watch, people? Anyway, the man came back from the bathroom and got under the covers. They fell silent. She had no idea what they were doing, but she was starting to think that it didn't matter. Then she noticed that the camera was showing a blank screen. The feed had dropped out. She kept listening, but everything was silent. After a few moments, the feed came back. The camera was showing a blue screen. It must have been a reboot. She heard the woman's voice. She sounded groggy. The woman was asking what time it was. The man mumbled something and rolled over. The camera panned across the bed to show the clock. It reads 7 a.m. They had been asleep for 8 hours. The live stream had somehow reset itself. She had no idea how. She listened as they got out of bed and started to make breakfast. They were talking in low voices. The woman was asking questions. The man was giving one-word answers. The conversation was brief. Then the woman left the room. The man started to pace. She watched as he walked around the house. He was muttering to himself, talking about the time, asking if everything was okay. He went to the window and pulled back the curtains. He looked out over the garden. She zoomed in to see what he was looking at. It was a private driveway. She had no idea whose house it was, but it looked familiar. Then it hit her. It was the house next door, her neighbor. She was renting out the spare bedroom on Airbnb. That explained a lot. It explained why there was a second camera. It explained why they had to have the plug socket in the bedroom. They were streaming to a private service, and they needed the bandwidth to do it. But who was watching? That's the real question. She wanted to find out, but there was no way to do it. The only way to find out who was watching would be to start watching herself. But she wasn't about to do that. Where's the fun in that? Anyway, she continued to listen as the man made breakfast. She heard him talking to someone on the phone. He was asking if everything was ready. He was told that it was. He hung up and turned back to the camera. He was smiling, but it was a strange smile. It was manic, almost evil, and then he whispered something. Something that she couldn't hear. Then he did something even stranger. He picked up the guest book and began to write something in it. She couldn't see what he was writing, but she could hear the scratching of the pen. He wrote something, then he stood back and looked at it. He muttered something and added a few more words. She had no idea what he was saying, but she could hear the deranged look in his voice. He turned away from the book and stared directly at the camera. He was grinning now, but there was no humor in his eyes. It was like he was enjoying some private joke. She watched as he walked out of the room. He was going to the window again. She zoomed in to see what he was looking at. The neighbor's house was gone. In its place was a dark website. She had no idea what the site was. It wasn't anything that she recognized. That's when the feed cut out again. The camera went blank. She heard the man's voice. He was screaming, cursing, trying to get the camera to work. She could hear the woman in the background. She was trying to calm him down. Then they both went silent. She listened, but there was nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No sounds of life. She didn't know what to think. Was this normal behavior? Was this a typical Airbnb experience? She decided to wait it out. After a few minutes, the feed came back. The camera was still aimed out the window, but there was nothing there. There was no house. In its place was the same dark website. That's when she heard the front door open. It was the neighbor. He was holding a flashlight. He was calling out for his wife and kids. She had no idea what was going on, but she could see that the man was scared. He walked through the house calling for help. The camera shook as he ran around. He was getting more and more frantic. Then he stopped. He was kneeling by the Christmas tree. He was talking in a low voice. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see that he was crying. The camera fell to the floor and the feed went black. She waited, but there was nothing. Then the front door slammed. The neighbor came back. He was wiping his eyes. He looked at the camera and smiled sadly. He turned away and walked out the front door. She watched him drive away. Then she heard the sirens. Police cars were coming down the street. She ran to the front door and opened it. The cops came in and began to ask questions. They wanted to know what happened. She told them what she knew, but they didn't seem to believe her. They went through the house and began to search. They looked in the attic. They looked in the bedroom. They found nothing. After a while, they left without finding anything. And that's how her story ended. The case remains unsolved to this day. What do you think happened? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, check out another episode, and thank you for watching. They booked a room in someone's home, but there was one room that the host always kept locked. And if you listen closely, you can hear some really strange noises coming from behind that door. Let us know what you think is behind that door in the comments below. And let's jump into the story. It was during the wintertime, and I had been working remotely for a few months and wanted to get out of town for a while. I'd heard about an Airbnb just outside of town with good reviews, so I decided to book it. When I arrived, I was surprised by how large the property was. It looked like a small mansion, or maybe even an old Victorian house. The interior seemed to have all the original features from when it was built, and the host had done a great job with the decor. It felt very homey. There were other guests staying there too, but they occupied the opposite side of the house. I had reserved a private room, and it came with a shared bathroom down the hall. On the first day, I didn't think much of anything strange. Everything was fine, but then the second day is when things started to happen. I woke up around 6 a.m. to what sounded like screams in the hallway. It sounded like a woman's voice, but it wasn't loud. It was more of a drawn-out scream. Then I started to hear these really loud footsteps in the hallway. Now it sounded like someone was dragging something heavy. They sounded like metal moans, kind of like the sound you might hear if someone dragged a metal chair across a wooden floor. And then the dragging would stop. Then I'd hear the footsteps again. This happened over and over throughout the morning. Now, my Airbnb host lived in the same house as us. Their room was at the end of the hallway. Every time I heard those sounds, I'd peek out into the hallway and see that their door was closed. That was odd to me, because every morning their door was open and I could see them in the kitchen making coffee. So I thought, okay, they must have gotten up early and left. So I went back to sleep. Later that afternoon, I came back into the hallway and noticed that the door was still closed and slightly ajar. I opened it all the way and called out to them, "Hey, you here?" No response. I knocked a couple times and still no response. Now, this is when I noticed that the handle of their door was different from the rest of the doors in the house. All of the doors in the house had these round knobs, but this door had a modern-looking handle like you would find on an exterior door. So a little while later, I finally got a hold of the host. I told them I was curious about the room at the end of the hall and asked if I could take a look. And they responded, "Sorry, I forgot to mention that room is not available for guests. It's where I keep all my cleaning supplies." Now, I'm thinking to myself, how big are your cleaning supplies? Because that's a pretty big room. But I didn't say anything. I just said, "Oh, no worries. Thanks for letting me know," and I closed the door. That's when I started to notice the smell. It smelled like stale water and mildew. Like if you dug up dirt that had been sitting underwater for a while. That's what it smelled like. And this is why I knew that room hadn't been used in a long time. I could tell because dust had collected everywhere else, but there was no dust on the door. It was perfectly clean. It almost looked like it had been wiped down recently. As the week went on, I kept hearing those dragging sounds every night. I also noticed that whenever I stayed in my room with the door closed, I could feel the cold air seeping underneath it. Now, our room was upstairs and it was plenty warm. We had a heater in there. In fact, we had the heater set to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. But there was this one spot right next to the door where it was always freezing cold. On the last night, I couldn't fall asleep. I just kept hearing those dragging sounds. I listened closely, and it sounded like someone or something was dragging themselves closer and closer to my room. So I sat up in bed and listened. I heard the dragging stop right outside of my door. And then I heard what sounded like someone knocking on the door. Knocking like they were trying to get my attention. Then I heard a loud bang on the wall next to my door. Now, I don't want to sound like a chicken, but I literally spent the rest of the night hiding under my covers. By the next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I checked out early and decided to leave. I didn't want to stay another night, so I drove home, and that was the end of it. Fast forward to weeks later, and I was reading through a missing persons article about someone who had gone missing in the area. And in the article, they mentioned that last place they were seen was at a house on Elm Street. And I recognized that address. It was the same address that I had stayed at. The photo of the missing person in the article was a woman. She looked around 30 years old. And I remember seeing a woman around that age checking in with her young son. They had stayed in the room directly across from mine. I immediately called the police to let them know that I had stayed there recently. I told them about the strange noises and the locked room and that it smelled like dirty water. And they thanked me for the information and said that they would come and search the room. Now, I haven't followed up with the police to see what they found. And to be honest, I'm kind of glad about that. I don't need to know what's behind that door. I think it's better if some mysteries are left unsolved. So I think this is a case where the host is definitely hiding something. Maybe there's a dead body behind there. Maybe it's just some creepy storage room that's being used for something sinister. Who knows? Let us know what you think is going on behind that door. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.